Good morning, everyone. Day 3 of Africa Summit. Welcome to those of you in the room and the International House. Welcome to those of you online. I'm Ksenia Chmutin. I'm the Director of the Institute of Advanced Studies. This is day 3 of Africa Summit. I hope you're all been enjoying the summit as much as I have been enjoying the first 2 days. The conversations have just been fantastic. We talked about sport yesterday, and today we're moving on to climate change. Which is of course very, very important, and we will be unpacking this theme through all sorts of perspectives today. Leading the day today is Professor John Downey, who is the Associate Pro Vice Chancellor for Climate Change and Net Zero. So without any further ado, John, over to you to introduce the speakers of the day.
Okay, brilliant. Well, thank you, Ksenia. It's a great privilege to introduce our keynote speakers and to chair the panel this afternoon. As Ksenia said, I'm Associate Pro Vice Chancellor for Climate Change and Net Zero, which is one of the 3 strategic themes of the university. We take a whole institution approach to climate change and biodiversity loss at Loughborough, which means that we're interested in education for sustainable development, what we teach, but also how we teach. We're interested in the research that we do, not only research about renewable energy and about behaviour change, but actually how we do the research to make the research practices themselves more sustainable. We're a bit of a sporty university, and so we're very keen to try and make our sporting events and activities more sustainable as well, and use our reputation as a world-leading sports university to try and influence national governing bodies and international bodies as well. We're very keen to encourage our commercial partners and our university partners and public partners to become more sustainable. Finally, we try and do our best to make our campus and its operations more sustainable, whether that's from the energy we use to our food policies to the way that we get around campus. It's very much a work in progress. There's a lot more to be done. I think this summit is a brilliant idea. Congratulations to Ksenia and to the other people who inspired this summit, because Africa is often neglected, but when we're talking about the subject of climate change, it's obviously hugely important. In the UK, we have a context in which many individuals, many corporations, many organisations, and indeed many universities have huge carbon footprints. I think I read a statistic somewhere. I don't know if it's true. I don't know how they calculated it. They said that UK universities are responsible for about 2% of universities of the country's carbon footprints. And of course, those emissions directly impact in the present day on people living in Africa. So it's one of the facts of climate change that the people who cause the most climate change are probably, or think that they are the least affected, and the people who are least responsible carbon emissions are the most affected. And to my mind, it's basically a new or a continuing form of imperialism, ecological imperialism or carbon colonialism, however we want to describe it. So I would say we have a huge moral imperative to act decisively now, and that's especially incumbent upon people living in richer countries, and I think intellectuals and people working at universities have a huge responsibility here, just in terms of communicating facts to society. So I can't underestimate how important the university sees this issue. We've got 2 great keynote speakers today. The first one is Matthew Leach, who is a Professor Emeritus at Surrey University, who's also a consultant in energy policy, and currently works with us at MEX, which is modern energy cooking services in the at Loughborough University. So I'll introduce the second keynote speaker, Sam, when Matthew's given his keynote. So Matthew's going to join us online, I believe. So thank you very much, Matthew.
Thank you very much. Okay, I can see you can see me. I hope you can hear me okay. And I think I should be able to share my slides. So let me see if this works. Okay, could someone just tell me that you can see my slides now?
Yep, all good.
Yep.
Okay, super. So apologies that I can't be there in person, and apologies also from Professor Ed Brown, who leads the MEX program, who was originally scheduled to speak in this slot. Ed's unwell, unfortunately, at the moment, so I've been asked to step in. And as introduced, I'm a professor at the University of Surrey in energy and environment broadly. But relevant to this, and why I think I've been asked to speak, is because most of my time is spent on the MEX program, where I lead work on clean energy, finance, and data analysis. And I've been asked to speak to this title around the status and pathways to net zero in sub-Saharan Africa, around strategies and challenges. The challenge for the title really is that Africa and sub-Saharan Africa are incredibly diverse places. And so I'm going to try and draw out some kind of key threads and some key areas of challenge, but also very much key areas of opportunity. But some of the detail is obviously in some of the devil is in the detail. And so maybe in discussion, we can get into some of that point. I guess some of you will know quite a bit about the MEX program, but for those that don't, just one slide just to give you a sense of what MEX is all about. But it does also link into the things I want to say in the next 25 minutes or so. So MEX is an 8-year FCDO funded program around sort of research and innovation, led from Loughborough, but with partners across the globe. And what we're trying to do is to basically stimulate a more rapid shift away from the use of biomass energy for cooking towards the use of modern energy forms of all types. A particular area of focus, and the thing we're best known for, is the interaction between clean cooking and electricity access. So it's around moving the idea of moving towards electric cooking. And the idea for that really is to leverage the much closer focus on electricity access deficits in the developing world to date than there has been to clean cooking. But let's focus on delivering the two together by kind of integrated planning. And that will be a theme I'll come back to in a little while. So first of all, I mean, just a couple of threads to what I want to say, and I want to start with just a few comments around the kind of global climate and net zero challenge, because I know some of you will be deep experts in this area, but I know this is also quite a multidisciplinary audience. So I want to set a little bit of the context before we get into the Africa situation in particular. So the International Panel on Climate Change kind of comes together, or it kind of culminates its work every 6 or 7 years, producing a sort of a state of the evidence report around climate change. And its most recent one produces a huge array of evidence around climate change, and one chart from the 4,000 pages of the science study that they produce is this one, and it's around the global surface temperature globally. And just by observation, I think you can see that over most of the 2,000-year span that's shown on this chart, there's been a gradual decrease in global surface temperature, but in the last 200 years, that trend has really reversed very rapidly with a big increase in global temperature. So that's just one indicator of global change. But IPCC also look at the causes, the attribution of those global changes, and again, one of their charts shown here basically takes that black line shown in the middle, which is that most recent sort of 200 years of the change in temperature, and looks at broad root causes for that temperature change. And what they found is that the natural causes, so non-human causes, are bumbling about in the middle there, sort of broadly neutral, some up, some down, some years, some other years the other direction. But natural is broadly neutral. And the majority of the change is attributable to human activity. And some of that human activity is actually cooling the planet. So its release of aerosols, particulates, and water droplets into the atmosphere actually helps to cool the planet from human activities. But that's much overwhelmed by the release of greenhouse gases to the atmosphere by humans, which is really driving this temperature change. So, one of their conclusions is that the changing climate is largely due to greenhouse gas emissions increases and concentration increases as a result. And another clear conclusion is that human influence is really behind those changes. So we saw some very positive developments in 2015 at one of the climate change conferences in Paris with the Paris Agreement, and this really was a landmark in this kind of series of annual conferences. And the outcome, broadly described in that first sentence, the central aim is to basically keep the world to below 2 degrees Celsius temperature change on pre-industrial levels, and to pursue efforts, was the language, to limit the temperatures to no more than 1.5 degrees. And that's recognizing that we're already past 1 degree temperature change since pre-industrial levels. So there's not a great deal of room for maneuver. And I've highlighted just in this yellow color a few other points from the Paris Agreement which are really relevant to Africa in particular. So the first bullet, parties aiming to reach global peaking of their greenhouse gas emissions as soon as possible. But for developing country parties, recognizing that peaking is going to take longer to achieve. That developed countries should continue to take a lead by setting absolute emission reduction targets, but that developing country parties can, in a sense, be slower about that activity and are not expected to set absolute targets in the near term. All countries expected to sort of set out their national position through these national determined contributions, and that international cooperation on climate change technology, both development, but also transfer and sharing of knowledge and capacity building for the developing world is a key priority. In terms of the global position, what gives rise to all those greenhouse gas emissions? Well, it's largely coming from the energy sector. It's at least 3/4 of the emissions are attributable to energy, and that's because globally, energy use over the last 50 years or more has primarily come from fossil fuels. And you can see the inexorable growth of energy use on this chart, and also that the share of contribution to that from the fossil fuels, the three main fossil fuel groups, has remained largely unchanged. Although what you can see growing on the top there is the renewables. And there's the green element of renewables, the fastest area of growth, but starting, of course, from a very low base. And in terms of electricity, so that particular form of energy that we all enjoy and increasingly want to have more of, where does that come from? Well, globally over that sort of 30-40 year period, it's primarily come from coal, with the other fossil fuels also contributing. But here we see that great growth in renewables also contributing in particular to the delivery of our electricity services. The International Energy Agency have produced a series of scenarios trying to understand the kind of global position and how to meet that Paris set of commitments between 1.5 and 2 degree temperature change limits. This is some of the outcomes of their stated policy scenario. And so this is what member parties to the UNFCCC agreements. So this is basically the world's countries. This is what they've said they're going to do. And there's some positive news here. And it means that global annual emissions, instead of continuing to increase as they have been doing, will broadly flatten, and we'll end up with them flat and maybe some very slight decrease. And the role of different sectors is shown in the chart on the right. But that flattening does not achieve the Paris outcomes. Their alternative scenario their net zero emission scenario is shown here. And what we need to do is by 2050 or soon after, we need to get the global emissions down to effectively zero. And the reason it's called net zero emissions is because some sectors we may be able to get close to zero, but not exactly below zero. Some continued use of fossil fuels, for example, in hard to decarbonize sectors. But we can balance that by removing more carbon out of the atmosphere through enhancing forestry and other land use measures, and maybe even engineering carbon capture and storage. But though we don't need to flatten emissions, as we saw in the stated policy scenario, we need very, very deep cuts in those. And then just digging just a little bit of the detail of how to achieve that ambition from going from where we are now, sort of 2020, soon after, to 2030, and then to 2050 of zero emissions. If we look at the emissions in 2020, by 2030, though, we'll have more activity, more GDP growth, more traveling and so on. So effectively by 2030, we're trying to also account for that potential increase in emissions. And so to get down to that 2030 target level, this is the mixture of activities that their analysis suggests would be an optimal pathway. And it's relying largely on the renewables, so wind and solar and bioenergy, and some others, of course. But 50% of it is being delivered through increased use of renewable energy sources. And then from 2030 to 2050, again, we'd see increased activity levels. So we're really trying to decarbonize from this level. And again, a set of measures that we could do that optimally. And the only slight change here is that we begin to see a much greater role for electrifying services that we currently deliver through fossil fuels. So this would largely be electrifying transport, as well as bits of industry, and a greater role for behavior change, of changing our energy using patterns, and so on, and also a role for carbon capture and storage. So this is what they're expecting we will need to do. Largely in the next 10 years, it's about delivering on renewables, substituting for fossil fuels, and then beyond that, deepening electrification. And I'll come back to those two threads in a few minutes. How are we doing on delivering on this deep decarbonisation scenario? Well, unfortunately, the IEA's scenario on policy sort of gave us that clue. The answer is we're not doing very well. I mean, this is a chart with the black line showing the historical emissions. Where we need to be, the trajectory we need to be on is broadly this green line. That's the one that's compatible with the 1.5 degree limit. But the most optimistic view of the current pledges and targets and policies and so on is one of these blue and green lines here, which is way off target. But even further off target is what's actually been written into law, the policies, the regulations, and the actions which we're seeing, which is hugely off target. So there's big delivery gaps on the targets that we want to achieve for Paris. Okay, so that's really just a sort of background to the global position. What about Africa and where that sits and where its climate priorities sit and how it might deliver on those? Well, like I said, Africa is an incredibly diverse place. So please excuse me to bring some broad generalizations. Broadly, most countries in Africa are running a bit of dual energy system, coexisting side by side. And what I mean by that is in well-developed urban areas, you'll have good electricity access, you'll have lots of petroleum fuels powering vehicles and high standards of living. But in many other parts of the country, particularly in rural areas, we've got a high reliance on biomass energy, wood, charcoal, and others, traditional energy sources, and very limited access to electricity. Across Africa and the developing world broadly, we've got fast GDP growth, we've got fast population growth, leading to something like 3% per year growth in energy demand, compared to maybe half that in the OECD regions. But of course, that energy use and GDP is growing from a very low base. We've got big energy inequalities, whether that's between social groups, between genders, in particular between that kind of urban-rural divide I spoke of already. We've got pretty unreliable electricity and other fuel supplies and pretty high losses in the distribution and transmission networks that bring those to people. In some countries, we've got an existing and somewhat growing fossil fuel dependence. So Nigeria, for example, pretty highly dependent on fossil fuels, but then new discoveries of oil and gas in Tanzania, in Madagascar, various other places. So who is going to deny that an African country that discovers oil and gas should not be able to use that for its development challenges, unless in some way we find some pretty compelling incentives and alternatives for them to do so in better ways. And then the final characteristic that I point to is that while improving, there are still pretty weak regulatory and governance arrangements in many countries, which limits their ability to both make policy and to implement change. Now, in terms of the electricity access and then the clean cooking access, looking across Africa, this is the IEA's kind of analysis of the situation. And the y-axis is the millions of people in Africa that currently do not have access. And so for electricity access, there's around 500 million people who currently have no access to electricity in their lives. And that looks as though we've achieved nothing over the last 20 years or so, and may achieve nothing by 2030. Well, that's not really the case, because what we have done is we've kept pace with population growth, which has been pretty rapid. So the number without access has not really changed that much. And the situation in clean cooking is much more dire than that, because there we have not and are not expected to keep pace with population growth. So that by 2030, there may be more than 1 billion people on the continent without access to clean cooking. And if we map out those access situations, first for electricity, and then on the next slide for clean cooking, or map them out globally, what you can see is that sub-Saharan Africa does strike one as somewhat of a global outlier in terms of its access to electricity, with most countries in the region, bar South Africa and a few others, in this sort of less than 50% access to electricity category. And as sort of hinted on the previous slides, the access to cooking is far worse. It's, Africa sort of shines out as a beacon of low access to cooking, with the majority of countries in sub-Saharan Africa in that category of less than 25% access to clean cooking solutions. And that clean cooking piece is what MEX is all about. So, no apologies really for bringing it through quite strongly here. There are 2.8 billion people globally still cooking with biomass fuels. And the WHO estimate something like 4 million excess deaths per year as a result, due to the indoor air pollution from the particulates in particular that affect the people who are doing cooking, particularly when that's indoors. But it also leads to impacts on the natural environment through deforestation and other land use change, as well as climate change emissions. And in particular gender inequalities, because it's women and often young girls who are both doing the cooking, but also often going to gather the biomass that's being used. So clean cooking has been a global priority for some decades, but historically the focus has mostly been on producing small and relatively cheap solutions for slightly improving the efficiency with which we burn that biomass, these improved cook stoves. Relatively slow uptake, not particularly popular, and actually, unfortunately, while they're a bit more efficient, even reducing the indoor air pollution by, say, 30% or 50% doesn't give you a 30 or 50% improvement in health outcomes, because the health response to air pollution does not scale linearly with the concentrations of pollutants in the atmosphere. In some places, it's been a focus on bottled gas. So you can see a lady here cooking with LPG. Clean in use, fewer air pollution emissions perhaps, but a fossil fuel and not consistent with a kind of a long-term net zero solution. And also normally imported and pretty expensive and high impacts on balance of payments for countries. So there's a strong interest now, we would argue, in electric cooking, and I'll come back to that in a few minutes. So our analysis of the cost of inaction on this clean cooking challenge for sub-Saharan Africa is something like $800 billion US per year in terms of the negative externalities on health, on gender, and on climate. So this has now been recognized internationally as a major challenge, and there's been considerable activity over the last year in particular to really raise the game. It's always been embedded as part of one of the UN's Sustainable Development Goals. So Sustainable Development Goal 7 is around energy access, and it's to ensure access to affordable, reliable, sustainable, and modern energy for all by 2030. And it has on the left-hand side these two elements of access to electricity, but also access to clean cooking. So it's right in there and always has been in the SDGs, as well as on the right-hand side, priorities around increasing the amount of use of renewables and improving the use of energy efficiency solutions and increasing the energy efficiency of economies. Now, in terms of global shares of greenhouse gas related emissions, this is the overall envelope of emissions and how it's changed over time, and of course it's rising as we saw on previous charts. But what this figure does is it shows the position of different world regions, and you can see that Africa's share in the middle there is very small now, and go back 50 or more years and it was really negligible. So Africa is not making a major contribution to global climate change. And that's really part of the reason why the Paris Agreement saw this idea of sort of differentiated responsibility and recognizing that different regional groups and countries, in a sense, don't need to move all at the same pace. So we've seen in terms of the engagement with the UNFCCC process for the Paris Agreement, particularly in terms of African countries, something like I think 54 published their first nationally determined contributions. So that's many of the countries in the region, but very few of them have then gone through and done more detailed sets of long-term strategies and net zero emission target setting, just recognizing some of the differentiated responsibilities I spoke to a few minutes ago. All right, so that's in a sense a bit of the doom and gloom, the challenges of access for electricity and for cooking, but also making clear that the pace of change for Africa does maybe not need to be quite as rapid as it is on Europe and North America and others. But there are opportunities through global transitions to net zero for Africa, and I want to highlight three of those. So this is a chart of the uptake, the historic uptake of renewables globally. And look, it's not surprising. We've seen elements of this on some of my previous charts about the delivery of electricity, for example. You saw that rising share of renewables. Solar is incredibly important to that, as well as wind and renewable hydropower. So renewables are a huge growing business and area of activity globally. And the IEA's analysis says that even 5 years ago, for Africa, solar PV and wind were already competitive to other forms of electricity generation. And their analysis suggests that by 2030, because of continued cost reductions in those sources of power, solar PV and wind would be just the cheapest sources of electricity for Africa, bar none. And so an opportunity for the cost reductions that come through innovation and learning by doing and scale of production globally for those renewable technologies is leading to those being the cheapest sources of energy for everybody, including for Africa. As a result, the IEA expect that for, let's look at sub-Saharan Africa at the bottom here, in 2020, relatively low amount of installed generating capacity in sub-Saharan Africa, but already something like 50% of it was renewables. But their expectations are for a doubling or even a tripling of that generation capacity for sub-Saharan Africa, and almost all of the growth coming through renewables. So that's my first sort of area of opportunity, really, is the role of renewables in Africa. The second area of opportunity I want to highlight is how electricity access is delivered. Well, traditional approaches to electrification anywhere in this country, in Africa, wherever it might be, is for large centralized generation, then delivered through high voltage transmission networks, and then regional, local, lower voltage distribution networks to wherever customers might be. And that's just the traditional model. But that's proven to be extremely expensive to bring electricity into very diverse countries with often long distances between areas of centralized generation and customers, and very dispersed customers with relatively low levels of electricity usage. It puts a very high cost on delivering that sort of infrastructure. And a much more cost-effective form of infrastructure is expected to be decentralized, where we see customers living close by some of the generation, whether that's from wind, whether it's from solar on the buildings, and local distribution networks sharing that capacity within smaller regions. And eventually you can connect up those decentralized islands one to the other to form a sort of a macro grid. But the delivery of electricity happens at that local level. And that kind of local electricity access, I mean, there's a number of different ways of electricity access, and number one shown here is that traditional grid, that centralized route. The decentralized route has a number of ways of doing it. One of those is by individual solar home systems, PV plus batteries on individual dwellings and individual businesses. And another is through mini grids, where we have a larger scale PV batteries shown here stored in a shipping container, and distribution wires going out to local homes and businesses. And the example shown here of a bar which has been electrified, bringing big economic and social opportunities. So that's my second area of opportunity, is capitalizing on new forms of electricity access. And the IEA expect that by 2030 for Africa, we will see, people who live within 5 kilometers now of an existing network, might be best to connect them by grid. If you live out to maybe 20 kilometers and beyond, it's better to connect by mini grid. And if you live in rural areas of low demand, actually that's standalone solar home systems is the optimal choice. And they've mapped what that might look like for sub-Saharan Africa on the right-hand side. And basically you see just sort of existing urban areas build out their grids, standalone systems in the rural areas, and then mini grids in that kind of halfway house. And then finally, my third area of opportunity is around clean cooking. You won't be surprised, coming from the MEX program. Electric cooking really is coming of age. There are different contexts. On grid, those grids are becoming increasingly reliable in cities, and then you can directly connect your electric cooking devices. But off grid, we've got falling costs of PV, we've got falling costs of battery storage, as well as rising costs of traditional biofuels. Modern appliances are super efficient. Here's a lady very happily carrying her new electric pressure cooker, and induction hobs also are very efficient. And electric cooking is already cheaper for households in many settings, in particular as charcoal costs are increasing with deforestation in some regions. And new business models are emerging to help spread the cost of upfront costs of appliances and upfront costs of solar home systems through, for example, pay-as-you-go, and also through carbon finance using innovations in digital metering and so on. MEX has been working with the African Union to look at how to deliver scaled access to clean cooking as a kind of co-delivered with electricity access across the continent. We've already soft launched this report, but it gets formally launched at the next COP, which starts in about 10 days' time. So I do recommend this for anybody who's interested in more of the detail of what's going on in individual countries. And my final thoughts, just a sort of few summary points. Africa faces the most severe climate change than most regions, yet has the least historic responsibility for the problem. It's something, estimated that by 2050, the IEA estimates Africa will have accounted for less than 4% of cumulative global climate change related emissions. Affordable energy is a key priority. Access to modern energy, including for cooking and in industry and all productive activities. A key and growing role for electricity can be delivered heavily through renewables, and a key opportunity for energy efficiency. So while leapfrogging is I think a rather outmoded term, there really is an opportunity for Africa to develop on the basis of renewables and energy efficiency in a way that we're now beginning to retrofit, but not necessarily needing to go through that high carbon route first. The global energy transition offers enormous opportunities for spillovers, positive spillovers into Africa's development for economic and social benefit. But I would note, of course, that this is going to need investment, and Africa's energy and climate goals is expected to need more than a doubling of energy investments this decade alone. And the next COP, starting in 10 days' time, has been referred to as the Finance COP. And it's about trying to deliver negotiations which leads to mechanisms and actions to finance a truly just climate transition, which will leave no one behind, including the people who reside in sub-Saharan Africa. So that's all. I'm sorry, I've probably rather filled my time, but very happy to take any questions or comments that you might have. And I hope you've got something out of that. Thank you very much.
It's up to you.
Matt, would you like to take questions now, or would you like to wait till after the second keynote?
Entirely up to you. Happy to do either.
Let's have the second keynote first, I think, and then have all of the questions together so people can be holding their thoughts. So it's a great pleasure to introduce you to Samuel E. Ardey Codjoe, who's our second keynote speaker. Sam is Provost of the College of Education at the University of Ghana, and also Professor of Population Studies. Did his undergraduate work in Ghana, and then an MPhil in Oslo, PhD in Bonn. And has worked on lots and lots of internationally funded projects. And I saw from your CV that you've also mentored lots of research fellows and researchers, as well as supervised a large number of PhD students. So that mentoring role, I think, is hugely important. And Sam's also been president of the Union of African Population Studies, so it's a great privilege to hear from Sam today. So thank you, Sam.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, you can go there if that's okay.
Yeah, thank you very much. And let me also thank the IS for having me here this morning for my presentation. So this morning I will be talking to you on the impact of extreme weather conditions on healthcare provision in urban Ghana. Okay. So as we all know, global surface temperatures are expected to rise during the 21st century. And this will be felt most in Africa, including the largest change in days when extreme temperatures are likely to impact population health. Also, the planet is likely to experience higher risk of flooding. And again, Africa and Asia will probably bear the greatest brunt. But these extreme weather events linked to climate change, we know, is proportionately affect the urban poor and their settlements. And in addition, hospitals and tropical climates must cope with extreme heat. And so recirculating air conditions is being used to provide thermal comfort. Yet we know that hospital wards may be poorly ventilated, and if additional ventilation is not provided or used, the air quality may be compromised, and therefore airborne pathogens will spread. So despite all these things that I've said, there is limited evidence in Africa on the extreme weather and health nexus. So this morning I will present to you two case studies. The first will look at the impact of extreme weather conditions on healthcare provision, and then another one that compares indoor air quality in naturally ventilated and air-conditioned hospitals. I will then go on to talk about some ongoing research that me and some of my colleagues who are present here are doing, and I'll acknowledge them at the end of my talk, and then consider further areas for research as far as the extreme weather and health nexus is concerned. So the main aim is for us to explore vulnerabilities of health services during flooding and extreme heat in two urban areas in Ghana. And then, most importantly, to identify the coping strategies that are being used to build resilience by health service providers and community members. In our view, some of these local perspectives that we learned will enrich our understanding of the vulnerabilities, resilience, and potential adaptations that are needed to enhance health service provision, not only in Ghana, that we undertook the study, but in similar settings in low-income countries. So I show you here the study areas. Accra and Tamale. Accra here is located right on the Gulf of Guinea, and then Tamale is in northern Ghana, which is in the Savannah area. So different populations and conditions. Accra's current population should be, we estimated at the time 2.3 million, but now probably getting close to 3 million, and then Tamale 0.4 million. Different conditions also in terms of temperature. Accra more humid, probably cooler, and Tamale much warmer. We did some studies in communities, in-depth studies, and we also had in-depth interviews in health facilities. For the health facilities, we targeted the pharmacy, and we also use government health facilities, so primary care and inpatient facilities, and then some private clinics as well, which had inpatient facilities. And then we deploy what we call tiny tags. So these are, small. I will show you a picture of it briefly very soon. Yellowish tags that are used to record temperatures. And so what I'm presenting to you now, data was gathered between May to July 2018. And we targeted laboratories, labor wards, outpatients department, waiting rooms, and then the children's ward. In addition, we had this tiny tag also mounted in 50 houses and then in 2 meteorological stations, which we use as more like controls or reference points. The standing tag had capability of taking temperature every 10 minutes and could be downloaded every 6 weeks. And the data gathered was analyzed for daily minimum, mean and maximum temperatures. So as I said, it's a picture of the tiny tag hanging there. And you can see it clearly down here. Each of the tiny tags was accompanied by a form which took information on, for example, the coordinates, the kind of building or structure that the data was taken from, and then whether there was any artificial heat or source like a TV fridge, just for us to know the actual readings we are having, and some other information that is stated there. Now you can see the location of some of the tiny tags in the Tamale area. So if you see the the yellow pins, those were the houses we took the temperature data. And as I said, for the reference sites, we also had the Tamale Airport, and then the campus of the University of Ghana. So you can see the Tamale Airport, and here's the Stevenson screen that is used to take the data, and then right beside it, we placed our tiny tag. So, and we also did, I show you images of some of the surveys we did. And my colleague, Rob Wilby, who is, here at the Lagos University, was very much part of it. Unfortunately, he couldn't join us for today. So this is like a typical setting, typical household setting in the Tamale area. And then for the monitoring of the carbon dioxide in the hospitals, we use 2 case study hospitals. So the first one is the Princess Marie Louise Children's Hospital in Accra, and then the Tamale General Hospital in Tamale. And we measured carbon dioxide concentration in 14 wards and waiting rooms, and also outside. And we use that as a proxy for indoor air quality. I also show you some images of, so the study was mechanical ventilation versus, artificial ventilation. So you have some images of the mechanical ventilation that is used air conditioning, mainly, and this in pediatrics units, you can see it's fully air conditioned. You know, this is for, I think, under 6 months children. Then some images also of the natural ventilation. So as you can see, you have louver blades that could be opened to bring in air to aid circulation. And to the far right, the carbon dioxide sensor we used. So here it's a picture of the sensor, and you can see more images of the installation of the carbon dioxide. And you see my colleague here, Ben Roberts, to the left, was the one who led that part of the study. And just to assure you that we went through all the protocols, and then so these gadgets did not interfere at all with, you know, the health service provision during the time we took the records. The only problem we had was our tiny tax, because, you know, it blinks in the evenings. And so it attracted quite a number of people. And at the time we were doing the study, you know, there had been these journalists in Ghana who had investigated the Ghana Football Authority president at the time. And he was, you know, he had captured him using hidden cameras and all that. And so that was a big issue in the country at the time. And so there were some of the health service workers who thought, you know, the tiny tax were hidden cameras. And so, you know, but we had to do a lot of convincing for us to put them there. In the end, people stole a few of our tiny tax. Yeah, but these are images of how we fix them all up. And then you can see it's not disrupting the activities of the health workers at all where they were placed. And this one is another picture of it. Okay, so some findings. So the first thing is extreme flood events are increasing in Ghana. There's no two ways about that. When we look at meteorological data, so over the past 5 decades, Ghana has been affected by at least 17 major floods, which have cumulatively impacted more than 60 million people and resulted in at least 144 deaths. In fact, the famous one was the 3rd January 2015 one that every Ghanaian relates to. That was very horrifying, you know. A lot of lives were lost. It's estimated that about 200 and something people died, but I would think the figures could be much, much more. Temperatures are also rising, whether in Tamale or in Accra. The data is showing that temperatures are increasing in the country now. So these are some of the recordings we did in Accra. So you see here this cooking area. This very popular is like we call the local. They are like local restaurants. We call them the chop bars. And sometimes when you hear of the jollof wars between Ghana and Nigeria, this is where most of the jollof comes from. And as far as I'm concerned, of course, this one is the best. This woman was recording 48.1 degrees Celsius in that facility, so you can imagine. And then there's a living room. It's a typical, you know, somebody's living room, recording 45.5 degrees. And then this cinema, you know, this has become very popular in the urban areas in Ghana now. You have these structures that could be cramped in with a lot of youth going to watch football games like the Premier League, the Bundesliga, the Spanish League, Champions League, name them. And they do a lot of betting when they go in there. You know? And these were recording 38.7 degrees Celsius. So you can imagine how warm it could be in there. Then in this ward, we recorded 33.8 degrees Celsius. But interestingly, look at this old building that has a touch at recording around 30.9 degrees Celsius. So my colleague Wilby has also published another paper that he talks a lot about some of these, you know, structures and the kinds of roofing and how they relate to the temperature. All this compared to the campus med site, which was recording 36.4 degrees Celsius. But what is going to fascinate you most is this old man we met in a blacksmith shop who was experiencing 61 degrees. It's unthinkable, you know. And we were thinking, how is he surviving in that shop? But yes, 61 degrees. So these are some of the vulnerabilities that people are having, and it's interesting to see what kinds of resilience and coping mechanisms they use. A typical living room here in the thermal area, 39 degrees, another 44.7. And this workshop this is a shop for a seamstress. So a dress designer, if you will. And this is also quite popular in the country. So you have these probably they call them the mistress, who have about 3 or 4 apprentices who are learning under her, and then they have this shop to operate from. And the question is, if somebody is working under 50.3 degrees Celsius, what you want to ask yourself is, how much would they be able to do, because of all the heat that they work with. But if you look at a typical structure also, but with shades, you could see that it's relatively much lower, 38.2 degrees. And so trees can be helpful in these settings. But in Tamale, there is a story around trees also, which maybe I'll tell you at the end of my talk. Okay, then coming to Accra, there was also the issue of the nocturnal heat islands, which was one of the study areas, so you could see how the temperature in Asia could be. So these are typical recordings we had in the healthcare facilities. So whether it's the maternity ward, the children's ward, outpatient department, labor ward, the laboratory, and then all compared with the meteorological sites, you could see that in all the instances, temperatures are quite high, hovering above 35 degrees Celsius. Then there is this one also that shows, it gives the temperature from 12 midnight to 11 p.m. So it's kind of like a full day recording. And in this case, we are comparing the maternity ward, children's ward, and then the reference point, which is the airport. Okay, so you will see that around midnight, the temperatures for both the 2 wards are hovering around 32 degrees Celsius, but for the meteorological sites is much lower. And then there's a dip around 7 a.m. and then it peaks around 2 p.m. You can see, and then declines again back to the morning levels around 11 p.m. So for me, what was interesting was how the airport sites was behaving, which I quizzed my colleague Rob about this morning, but maybe Ben here can talk a bit about that during the questions and answers. Then we followed the health workers also into their homes, because we wanted to find out what kinds of temperatures they do experience. Okay. And again, across board, for all the communities that we took recordings, you could see some health workers are sleeping under conditions that are close to 44 degrees, 45 degrees Celsius. And the issue is when you have situations like that, people maybe are unable to sleep well. And therefore, when they come to work, what could be the implication? Could this have effects on how productive they are during the day? These are things that we can do further research on. Now, let's quickly look at some impacts of extreme heat on health facilities. So on the average, all the health facilities were 5 degrees Celsius warmer than the meteorological site, okay, because of the great thermal inertia of buildings and influence of urban heat islands. Okay, so what this means is that when temperatures that the office is churning out, it's quite different from what people are actually experiencing in their own rooms. And the difference of 5 degrees, 5 degrees is a lot. A difference of 5 degrees in temperature increases quite a lot. Mean indoor temperatures for health facilities was generally about 1.7 degrees Celsius warmer in Tamale than Accra, which is understandable. But the mean night temperatures are also slightly cooler in Tamale than Accra. It was indicated that during periods of extreme heat, there are more respiratory problems, dehydration, hypertension, strokes, cerebral meningitis, asthma, boils, and heat rashes. So these are the conditions that are mostly experienced. And then, in situations where you have poor ventilation, the heat is exacerbated. And it has been shown that, when you put ceiling fans, they are not effective when temperature hits 34 degrees. So whatever will be happening when a ceiling fan is blowing, it's virtually blowing the heat. We talked to a surgeon who indicated to us that as a result of the heat, sometimes they do sweat into open wounds during surgeries. And as we know, this has the possibility of infection. And one funny thing with the Ghana power companies and the water companies is that anytime it is projected that there will be, extreme heat or floods, they shut off the electricity and the power sources. I don't know, maybe to prevent electrocution. Okay, so this has implications in the health facilities that we researched. To the extent that some nurses told us that there were instances that they had to set up intravenous fluids and even perform surgeries using mobile phone lights. As we know, lack of water and power outages also has implications for hygiene. And the pharmacy also loses a lot of refrigeration during extreme heat and drugs are damaged. The issue of the vaccination could change if you think of all these community health workers that will normally carry these small ice chests and put the vaccines and go into the communities to undertake vaccinations. Sometimes they lose the freezing in the ice chests due to extreme heat. In fact, there was one of them who had returned from a trip when we were sitting in the health facility, and she opened the ice chest to show us, and the frozen, the frozen water in those boxes had all melted. So which means that those drugs that were supposed to be frozen may have been damaged at some point. In terms of flooding, they reported more malaria cases, respiratory infections, typhoid, cholera, gastrointestinal problems, and diabetes, they said. In fact, we were told of the no-bed syndrome, which is it's more or less like an adage in Ghana now. Because during these periods, every health facility you go, they tell you there is no bed. So you have to move to the next facility. There's no bed. You move to the next facility. So it has been termed the no-bed syndrome in the country. And according to the nurses, when in situations like this, they can take females to male wards, and children to, adult wards and things like that, because the whole place is jammed up and there is a mess. We were told that flood waters can reach waist-high levels, and so they will, in instances like that, they have to move equipment to higher levels. So for some of the facilities that are privileged and have generators, they have some of their generators being damaged. And sometimes they lose their medicines, supplies, and equipment. I've already mentioned the electricity supply, which is disrupted, okay, but the power companies do disconnect to avoid electrocution. But sometimes communities are also, isolated from services. And this has implications for those who are on regular medication. If you take mental health patients, those who are diabetic and hypertensive patients who are on regular medications, when this happens, there is implications for them. So in one of the nurses, indicated to us that the emergency responses that we have to floods are largely focused on physical health, and then maybe they need to consider mental health. Yeah, because when people have lack of, safe and dry places to sleep during periods of extreme flooding, this can result in lack of sleep and increase stress. Let me now turn my attention briefly to talk about the carbon dioxide readings, and then I'll round up. Now, as I said, we use Accra Hospital and then the Tamale Hospital. So you can see that for almost all the facilities, outdoor, PCO, PD, and all that, the readings were within the threshold, which my colleague tells me is about 950 parts per million. But if you look at these two wards, the intensive care unit and the emergency, you could see that the readings are much, much higher. In fact, this almost up to 2,500 parts per million. Sorry. Okay, and then if you look at the Tamale Hospital also, look at the maternity waiting area and the pediatrics area, they also had very high readings. And this gives us an indication that these wards were having recirculating air conditioning, and there was no ventilation. And so they had the highest concentration. This was monitored in the pediatric ward, and you can see, a reading for the day, so from 6 a.m. to around the same time the following day. And you can see, if you look at the trend, the readings are very high, okay, up to the point where around maybe 7 a.m. it drops drastically, and this probably gives us an indication that the nurses have returned to the ward for the following day and then open the windows briefly. And the same also for the emergency ward, because of very poor ventilation. And whichever time you look at, the readings were way above the recommended thresholds. So as far as the carbon readings were concerned, indoor air quality was quite okay in most of the wards because they were below the 950 parts per million. But those that had air conditioned ward had poor indoor air quality. And but the issue also is that for people's thermal comfort, the issue of dust in these areas and mosquitoes are of concern. So that's the main reason why they will want to shut those windows during the rainy season. Now, how do they build resilience to extreme heat? They have plans to install large windows and doors with nets to increase ventilation. Potential for solar-powered air conditioning being explored, but how can this be sustainable in these kinds of settings? And then they also talk about early warning. And to floods, sometimes they do mobilize their community members to clear, the drains so they are not blocked. And they build race areas. We saw evidence of some of those when we visited the hospitals to try to stop the floods from entering the wards. And they also talk about early warning. We recommended that they should explore design changes to reduce the impact of flood events in health systems, build race pathways, okay, then have contingency planning for power outages, and good battery operated touches because of the issue of the power outages, and then potential for solar powered air conditioning, although that could also not be sustainable. But effective early warning systems could help. But then we make the case that these early warning should be embedded in the existing communication structures, because it is one thing providing people with early warning, but the next issue is what would they be able to do with the early warning, which is key. So as far as our ongoing work is concerned, we moved on to do what we call the refit project, also sponsored by the British Academy and that is reducing the impact of extreme heat to improve well-being in cities. In that one, we are trying to do dynamic thermal modeling and remodeling of existing buildings, and then construction of full-scale experimental buildings. The idea is to have low-cost options for remodeling houses, both formally and informally, so we can counter extreme heat. And then we are also trying to look at extreme weather events and mental health, because that came up as a result of some of the interviews we did. And we have one of our colleagues who is looking at extreme heat and learning outcomes in basic schools. So we've built these prototypes on the Investor Development Studies campus in Tamale, as you can see. And we are monitoring quite a number of variables. My colleague Ben can talk a bit more about that during Q&A. As you can see, he's in one of the rooms. And in terms of future research for the entire extreme, heat, climate, and health analysis, proposing the following, to look at strategies to overcome data silos, and provide robust data frameworks and digital health systems to safeguard data emerging threats. We can also utilize AI and machine learning to develop and enhance predictive climate-related incidents and early warning systems in healthcare, and also to look at some innovative approaches like One Health and some technologies that can be deployed to improve disease surveillance systems, and especially re-emerging diseases, and then also community engagement and training for health workers. We need to look at that. Let me acknowledge my colleagues, Rob, who is here at Lab Road to the extreme right here, could not join us this morning. And also Kate Goff, who I understand left Lab Road just about a month ago and relocated now in Lund University. And then Paula, of course, I was in the same health team with Paula, so we did a lot of the health work together. And I was looking through my notes, Paula, and I saw that there was a manuscript we started working on, but we probably abandoned that. Of course, Ben is here, and unfortunately, we lost our colleague Paul here during the COVID pandemic. So may his soul continue to rest in peace. Thank you.
So thank you very much, Matt and Sam. Are there any questions?
We have a couple of questions online, if we want to go.
Yeah.
I can read them out for you. So there are a couple of questions for, I think, Matt, but and then a comment for Sam, I think, from Janet. So question for Matt, first question is, what are the implications of phasing out fossil fuels on energy security in view of current challenges in the sub-Saharan Africa?
Yeah, sure. I mean, these are all pretty big questions. I think, a few things. I think there's a big opportunity and benefit that many African regions are, in a sense, building up new energy systems, expanding but building up new energy systems. Whereas here in the UK and Europe, we're largely about retrofitting what we've already got. And the opportunity to build new energy systems means that you can build renewables, you can build appropriate storage associated with them, you can develop the flexibility in how electricity, for example, is used as you go appropriately. And I think there is therefore an opportunity to kind of do it from scratch better than we have had of having to try to retrofit these things on top of what we've got used to. You're always going to want and need a mixture of different energy sources, and I think for Africa there will be a role for fossil fuels for some years or decades to come. And I do think there will be a big role for energy storage. We're seeing that everywhere, really, and the costs of energy storage are falling in the same way that the costs of renewable generation are falling. And so we can anticipate, PV plus batteries becomes a kind of a unit that delivers you secure power. So just a few thoughts.
Shall I read the second question? Okay. Second question also for you, Matt, and then there's a question for you, Sam. In view of the high energy gap between the global north and the global south, with women most impacted health-wise from pollution, from use of firewood and cooking and other social challenges, how then can energy policy support sustainable development such that none is left behind?
Yeah, I mean, I guess this is just central to having an energy transition that is just, and I think there is a lot of attention to that now, both in international development organisations, but also then in private companies that want to get involved, in finance institutions that want to be there lending money for building new infrastructure and so on. So, I mean, it's clearly a huge challenge, and many of the decision makers. I mean, I referred in my presentation to the relatively weak governance and policy making in many places. And I think part of that weakness actually is that most of the policymakers are men, certainly the senior ones. And there's a growing role of women in civil servants and civil servants in government and civil societies throughout Africa. But I think, like across the world, we need to see an acceleration of that process. We need increasingly, I think, do see gender requirements and the needs of disability groups and others being built into the decision-making frameworks for international lenders, for example. So I think largely that's there already in international lending around the role of development assistance organizations. So we need to see those kind of equity principles being kind of strings that are attached to investment money that's going to come through. But I think on a positive note, I would say that I think most countries with which I've been associated, most of the African most of the African countries see women as a huge economic opportunity. It's partly about reducing the impacts in terms of indoor air pollution, but it's also about mobilizing a very large chunk of your population into economic activity. And that's partly through employment, it's partly through establishing new companies. And I think that is a big opportunity, and I think it is already coming through in policy. I don't know, just a few thoughts on a very big topic.
Super, thank you, Matt. And there's a comment for you, Sam, from Janet as well. Data gathering is extremely low in Africa, so the impact of heat variation on the people not often captured, especially during extreme high temperatures. And there is also low access to energy to power cooling devices, and there is none to the poor. Would you like to respond to that? More of a comment?
Yeah,
question.
I think she's Janet, you said.
Janet,
I think she's right. Before we did this work, I think we cited one study in South Africa, Limpopo region in South Africa, that also gathered a similar kind of data, but from an outpatient department and waiting room. That was the only evidence that existed at the time. And even as we speak, I don't know. Most people would normally use the Matthew data and try to scale them to the communities they are working in. But we recognize that there could be variations even within the same setting. And so it's important to have these kinds of measurements, although it's not so expensive because the tiny tags are not so expensive. But it also has issues with whether you are intruding into the privacy of people and all that. But all in all, if we can continue with these kinds of work and implement them in probably other settings, I know quite a number of studies have been done in the global north. But as far as the global south is concerned, these are probably the first generation of work that has started. So we'll probably have to look for more opportunities to continue to do these things, and then we can relate it to so many other variables, apart from health variables. And what was the second?
It was just a comment for the access.
It's probably also worth saying something that we were asked at the end of the study was why didn't you measure humidity? And it's something we wish we had done. With retrospect, but the budget was very small in the study. So any budding scientists out there looking for the next question, I think looking at heat and humidity together would be something that would be very important, particularly in regions like Accra, where the humidity, yes, and discomfort that comes from the heat.
So I got a question,
Yes.
given, so that project was, the data was 2018, is that right, or just a few years ago, relatively recent data?
And what the one I use for these presentations were, I think, collected.
2018, 2019, just before COVID,
And then
wasn't
the
it?
hospital was 2022, so in the middle of COVID.
Yeah.
So those temperatures are really hard to imagine. For me, and a lot of the most recent research says that it's going to be really difficult to continue economic activity at those sorts of temperatures as they currently stand. But temperatures increase further, then it's really hard to imagine economic activity progressing. So I just would, how adequate do you think are the mitigation recommendations that you make? 'Cause it seems to me that the only way to change this is actually to stop temperature increase. That's the way to actually address this issue. Rather, the mitigation effects are going to be limited at that temperature.
Yeah, well, so, okay, if you look at the other publication I spoke about from my colleague Rob, he also looked at situations where there is, for example, a tree that is serving as a shade in the house, and some of those were making little differences in terms of the temperatures that were being recorded. But then I also told you about the issue of tamale and growing trees. So then my recommendation would be that if people can grow more trees in some of these areas surrounding their houses and all that, it will help to some extent. Okay, but the issue with tamale is there is this belief, there is a myth, or so that if you plant a tree, then you must make sure that you nurture the tree to grow. Because if the tree doesn't grow and the tree dies, then you are also going to die. So that's scary.
Which is a problem because lots of trees die, don't they?
So people, you talk to the people there, they say, well, I don't want to plant a tree, because I can't guarantee. So that's one.
So some of the barriers to resilience are beliefs and culture.
That's there. And then the second issue I also want to touch on is, so I don't know if it's also has to do with modernization, and it is probably complicating the situation, because you found in some of these areas people have thatched roofing, and they had well ventilated rooms. Okay, all of a sudden everybody is converting to aluminum roofing in the first place, and also using these we call them sliding doors and sliding windows, okay, in their houses. So even in Tamale, very warm conditions, you find people when they don't even have air conditioning in their homes, but they've installed all these sliding doors and windows that virtually, traps everything in there. So some of the mitigation things could, maybe going back to some of the old technologies or the indigenous technologies that people used to have well ventilated rooms instead of, closing them all up. And I don't know how people are going to feel about touch, because the evidence was there that was much cooler. But they give all sort of excuses that it can be infected with reptiles and all that. So people have used this roofing, and then with the roofing, the fancy ones are the ones that are colored, so it's reddish or brownish. I don't know why. And so even if they made it white, it will help. You know, so when in one of our dissemination seminars in Tamale, a kid golf, I think appeared in the headlines of the news because he indicated that maybe instead of painting these roofs red, why don't you paint them white? Then he said, oh, a British scientist says we should all paint our roofs white. It was a bias. So those could be some. So those would be some of the things people could do, to mitigate some of these things. But unfortunately, they are rather going the opposite.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for the two presentations, very insightful. Now, in light of the issues we've learned from Ghana, where temperatures are rising, and surely we can see the effects are so devastating. And earlier we learned from Mark's presentation that there's a gap between what is expected in terms of the achievements of the net zero and where we are in the intended targets. Now the question then becomes, what are the problems behind the lack of achieving the targets? What are the key issues behind that? What are the challenges that are really driving this lack of progress?
Is that for Matt or for everyone?
Are they political issues? Are they what is it that is really stopping this? Because we all know this has to happen, but it's not happening. So the question then becomes, where are the issues? Which is stopping this progress happening?
Maybe Matt. Why I
can, from my perspective, I think that rich countries don't want to forego some of the behaviours that result in large-scale carbon emissions. They still want to consume lots, and so not prepared to make the sacrifice.
It's a selfish approach to saying, look, we want to get on the way we've been doing. We don't want to change. That's what it is, basically. The political.
I think there's a lot of my personal feeling is that a lot of it's down to that people don't want to change their lifestyles, their behaviours, to address the problem.
Sorry, can I jump in here? Good morning, everyone. I'm actually an energy engineer. That's my master's, and I have about 6 years experience in installing solar systems in Nigeria. And I've spearheaded projects. I've installed over 1.2 megawatts solar systems. So that's why I have to jump in here just to kind of bring another perspective to the narrative. When it comes to the general issue in terms of policies and dealing with, in other nations trying to get net zero, you might have the political plays happening with the governments, with corruption and all of that going on. However, when it comes to the people, using Nigeria as a case study, which is where I have first-hand experience, we know we don't want to be in the carbon emissions, high cost of electricity and even having blackouts. And we don't want to be in the whole charcoal biomass phase. So what we are doing is many companies, many families are installing solar systems in their homes. So it's unfortunate that majority of Nigerians provide their own water. So how we did that was we installed boreholes. So almost in every home you see in Nigeria, they have their own boreholes. So practically I generate my own water. And then now we're generating our own power. So offices, schools, homes have solar systems. And depending on how wealthy the persons are, you can have systems that go from as small as maybe powering a television, a fan, some light bulbs, to actually powering ACs, boreholes, like we're talking about 10 kVA solar system in the homes. So it's not like people don't want to change their way of life, or they're open to change. Like I said, the limiting factor is just how much do they have to actually install, because they're not cheap, right? Because we're not manufacturing them in Nigeria. So when they come in, when they're imported, the custom. So you have to do the custom clearing, and that drives up the price a bit further higher. So a bit higher. So if those people don't have enough money, they go for just the smaller solar systems. But if they have, a lot of money, they go for the bigger one. So basically, in my personal case, my family and I, we don't use, when we're in Nigeria, we don't use the grid most times because we're fully on solar. So we could go months, on solar, and that's what many companies are doing now. Just last 2 weeks, the national grid collapsed 2-3 times in a week. So I mean, how can you do business with that, right? So those who suffer from that which is sad, because many persons still, because we're a country of 200 million plus people. So many persons are still not having enough energy to take care of what they need. So you have people who have their food in the freezer and they go bad, high cost of living and all of that. But there is that shit. So if you give someone that funding, they are not going to wait for the government to come connect power to their home. They are going to go for clean energy. And they're going for charcoal or whatever, no. So most people are even going to gas now for cooking, going now to the clean cooking. So many persons are going more to gas. So they get the cylinders and then they just, and it's even cheaper than having to go look for, charcoal or whatever means to cook, So they're leaving kerosene, they're leaving woods and charcoal kind of cooking, they're leaning more towards the gas for cooking, even those in the rural areas. So I think there is that shift happening. When it comes to the policies, that's where, like I said, I also mentioned that yesterday too. Sometimes our leaders go for this summit, they go for this conferences, they go for this COP events, and they tell you yes. And they come back with, oh yes, we attended this after spending lots of money with their entourage, and then they do nothing. They just leave it till the next time. So that's where that's bridge your asset comes from. It's not like we don't have the money. We have the money in the country as a country, but we just have leaders who are not yet ready to put their money where their mouth is.
Sorry.
There's sorry.
Question in back.
Your picture, the last picture you showed on the slide. I want to believe the person sitting in the middle is probably a local chief, right?
Yes.
That picture is really powerful. And I wanted to explore if you've considered using faith-based organizations as part of making inroads in terms of raising awareness campaign, resilience strategies, and addressing some of these cultural myths to breaking, to accepting, for example, planting trees. For example, how can we use those kind of local solutions? Let me put it that way: local solutions to address some of these challenges. Because if you don't use those, they will not plant the trees. Because there is a very strong attachment to cultural, you may call it sentiment or whatever. Well, so that's what I'm asking. Is this something you've explored in using the chief to talk to people? Because people respect their pastors even more than researchers these days.
Well, yeah, I think that's a very good point. But my quick response is that, and this morning we were having a discussion about it. We, as I said, we still have unfinished business. We've actually, the project kind of stalled at some point when COVID came in and all that funding issues. So all the plans we have for dissemination and going back to the communities and trying to address some of these issues, we have not done yet. Okay, but now I think we are in a position, I don't know, Ben, we are in a position to see how we can be able to leverage on a few things to be able to go round up some of these things. Because in fact, we did found out a lot of things that needs to, we need to go back and engage with the communities on some of these things. And then faith-based organizations, civil society organizations are really going to play a key role in that.
Okay. Yeah, so the work so far, the first project, which Sam talks about, is very much identifying the problem. Then the second part of the project, where you saw those experimental buildings, that was designing new buildings and mitigations. So then there's a missing third part of the puzzle, as Sam just said, which is where we go back and encourage implementation. We did a bit of work in the second project
talking to people about the types of retrofits they might like to see that might be acceptable to them and affordable to them. And we did lots of interviews and photo voice studies where people took photographs of parts of their houses they liked or things that they thought made them feel hot. But I can see Andrew Simmons is on the call, and he's done a lot of work in Tanzania using faith-based solutions to encouraging people to make environmentally conscious decisions and using religious texts to encourage people to change their retrofit behaviours and actions. So I can put you in touch with Andrew if you want to discuss more.
I have a couple of questions online. Question for Matt. I have a colleague, school teacher in Tanzania. Their household copes with intermittent electricity supply by having the following for cooking: single induction hob, single gas hob, LPG, direct electric hob, and a microwave. The microwave has a double direct electric hob on it. Cooks on biomass when they have lots of gas. Seems sensible range of cooking fuels to have availability. Generally, try to use the cleaner fuels as much as possible. Is this a common, in quotation mark, middle class response also in Ghana?
I think it's a common response everywhere, actually, and I was just in the middle of typing a response, but I'll say it now. So I think for poorer households, they often couldn't afford to perhaps purchase or have available more than one cleaner cooking solution, but they will typically keep their older traditional stove, wood or charcoal based, exactly as Andrew says, for cooking when they've got more people coming, or maybe if the supply of electricity or gas, whichever clean cooking solution they're moving to, has some supply interruptions. So yeah, absolutely, that kind of fuel stacking is super common. For wealthier households, middle class and others. I mean, we all in our daily lives in the UK have more than one cooking device, whether it's a toaster and a kettle and a stove and a microwave. And of course, people aspire to be able to have that convenience. So households that can afford it will certainly have a variety of devices. And I think, as Andrew's Tanzania example says, one of the benefits of that is you can then stack across different fuel types. So if there is supply interruption, you can kind of cover your bets by having something from different sources. I think from our MEX program, I think one of the things we would aim towards is to try to move towards a clean fuel stack, so that rather than an electric stove plus charcoal, it might be electric plus gas, or going forward it might be multiple electric devices with gas or with some other kind of clean fuel. So it's just, for us, it's just about trying to kind of take as much of that biomass combustion out of the house as possible. But yeah, absolutely, fuel stacking is a natural solution. Yeah, good point.
Thank you. And well, Sam, could you describe the rate of uptake of air conditioning units in Ghana? How widespread is this?
Unfortunately, I don't have that data, but I would not say it's widespread. I mean, in urban areas, you find a few privileged people who have them. It's rural areas, quite non-existent. But yeah, I don't think it's that high. Yeah.
There is one more which I missed earlier, sorry, Janet. What role will international cooperation play in achieving global net zero in Africa?
Do you want me to have a crack at that? Yeah, I mean, huge roles. As a researcher, and sitting in, we're all sitting in university, as we would expect. There's a role for research and cooperation to kind of help identify and then sort of disseminate opportunities. And that's what a lot of us kind of are engaged in. I think at a larger scale, there's a big role for kind of development organizations, the big international aid organizations, plus parts of the World Bank and others, to help, in a sense, leverage private finance. So if there's a opportunity for putting in a solar farm, for example, it might be very attractive to do that in sub-Saharan Africa because the sunshine is that much more reliable and stronger than it might be in Europe, for example. But the investment risks will be higher because of all sorts of political issues and delivery concerns. So there is a role for international organizations to take a first stake in that project, and to use their their need to make less profit in a sense. You know, they can put money in, whether it's loan, whether it's equity, and either not expect to get that money back at all, or to do it at very low rates. And by doing that, they're reducing the risk for others who come in and cover the rest of the cost. So leveraging private sector investment, I think, is a really important role for international cooperation. And finally, I think bilateral, so between maybe an African state and European, Asian, North American country, and also multilateral engagement at the kind of government level is really growing in importance. So in the climate, in the carbon market area, part of one of the mechanisms coming through on the from the Paris Agreement is what's called Article 6 of the Paris Agreement, and that's about this international collaboration to basically channel money from developed to developing country economies. And that started, and it kind of basically builds on the fact that developed economies are signed up to tough targets for reducing their emissions. And while the process encourages one to do that domestically first, or encourages companies to do it through reducing their own emissions first, the agreements in Article 6 leaves room for basically investing in other places to meet some of your carbon emissions reductions. And Article 6 of the Paris Agreement is about countries kind of coming together. So Kenya, for example, doing a deal with whoever it might be, Singapore, for example, so that some of Singapore's domestic emission reduction target can be met through investments which are made in reducing emissions in Kenya. And that kind of thing is kind of international cooperation, I think, is going to be very important for delivery for Africa.
I've got a question for you, Matt, as well. There's you identified some opportunities, in terms of, one of them was in renewables. Do you see any possibility of exporting renewable energy? I've heard that there are some schemes that are looking at that. Is that just hype, or is there some basis to that?
No, there is huge basis, and it's already being, in a sense, commercialized. So I think there's one very large scheme which is about bringing basically solar electricity from Morocco, I think, yes, to the UK, into Europe, by very large undersea high voltage DC electricity cables. And I mean, it's got lots of technical advantages. More sunshine in Morocco than here. Actually, there's a little bit of time difference which can help as well, because you're kind of generating at times when perhaps with the time difference, you wouldn't be generating in the UK from your own renewables, and in a sense maybe you're passing money from the UK in a sense into Morocco, which you imagine has got development benefits. So that, as far as I know, that is proceeding. There is a company that is developing that. It's multi-billion investment. There's similar schemes in the hydrogen area. So everyone's excited about hydrogen fuel of the future. Well, yes, but you've got to make it from renewables, otherwise it's not low carbon. But there are lots of people who are looking at putting hydrogen production alongside renewables in Africa and other parts of the developing world for the same reasons, because you get more output from your PV plant, for example, and then potentially selling that hydrogen to the world, and you ship it off in refrigerated tankers. If I'm sounding a little bit cynical, it's only because there are also voices which are saying this is another form of kind of colonialism, that it's a bit of a resource grab. Done right, it should be about investment flowing from the global north to the global south. Done wrong, it's about us grabbing land to make cheap energy to satisfy our insatiable desire for energy. So I think it has to be done very carefully. And I'm not close enough to any of those schemes to be able to say which ones are being done well and which ones are being done badly. But yes, huge opportunity, but some concerns.
Yes, I don't have all the data, but I know that when the World Cup was held in Qatar, so they had to cool, they have very similar temperatures to Tamale, 50 plus. and they had to cool their stadium. And I know because I had a few colleagues that were involved in the research around cooling the stadium. So unless it's not in the public domain, there may be some way of cooling without using touch. And maybe it's worth exploring.
Now, what would be the cost implication?
It's worth exploring. I agree they have deep pockets and.
Let me
do that.
answer to that. So for the Qatari World Cup,
Yes.
the systems were supplied by Daikin.
Okay.
I was opportune to meet with the head of research at Daikin. That's how I knew this. They spent a lot of money with chillers. They had tons, like 10-ton chillers around the whole stadium. They had to cool the pitch itself. So it was a lot of money. So I don't think it's.
So it wasn't, so the model that we used was just pump on your and let's crack it.
It's Qatari. They had
It wasn't.
It's cooling the outside.
Yeah.
Right, okay.
We have considered things like evaporative coolers, particularly in the north where the air is very dry.
Yeah.
But then we had issues when speaking to people concerned about mosquitoes when you're storing large volumes of water. So the preference for people is air conditioning. That's what they'd like to move to. And I think it's great what you were saying about moving towards solar power. We haven't explored that. We've been mainly looking at passive solutions, so ways to insulate or ventilate buildings. But maybe we just jump that and move straight to solar with air conditioning.
Yeah, and just even to give you an idea, if you're considering the passive, because I worked with the civil engineer who does architectural work as well. So what they do is, like the building you guys have, the prototype, you made your blocks straight, and then you cemented, right?
Yeah.
So he said you could have them sideways because they have holes.
Yeah.
So you put that, and then you can put a net. So just because of mosquitoes, do you understand what I mean? Instead of putting your blocks like this, you make them sideways, so that hole serves as a natural ventilation, for air to just pass through, so maybe you can also look at that.
Yeah, we've seen that in some school buildings, in Accra, ventilation blocks.
Yeah.
Which are also good because they're secure, so people can't break in overnight and things.
I have a question for Ben. So the season in which you took your data, what season was it? Was it like the hottest season at that period or was it?
No, so the data that Sam presented was just from the rainy season.
From the,
in
so it could
July.
be hotter.
It's gonna be cooler and they're gonna have the windows closed. We've actually got 2 years worth of data now, which we haven't published yet, that will capture the summer period, the dry period as well. So I think that'll be really interesting to see.
So the data around the blacksmith and those are those.
No,
Sorry,
that
no,
was
no.
a separate project, and
Ah,
that
right,
we
okay.
did cover the whole year, so that captures the hot season.
Okay.
Yeah.
Because if that was rainy season, then you can imagine what happened.
I'm still thinking.
60 degrees.
If we tint windows, you're talking about the new windows, if it is tinted, won't it have any effects?
Tinted. Oh,
Tints, I mean, it does, yeah.
Because?
Yeah, I know there will be cost implications, but we're talking about maybe they have moved there because the lowers break. And it's not that easy to handle, but you have one plane of glass and you can shut it.
no,
But if you
that's
tinted it,
not a
maybe,
reason at all. I
Oh.
mean, it's just, people try to look modern.
Yeah.
That's all,
And because we're at the equator, the sun is so high in the sky,
Yeah.
you get very little direct solar radiation through windows. Most of the heat is coming in through the roof. So by switching to a tinted window, it gives you privacy and a modern look, but also it blocks your ventilation. So it's the roof that we're mainly concerned about.
Yeah, and even the windows, because sliding, they're not like fixed. Yeah, they're sliding windows.
Yeah, but because of the dust issues and all that,
Yeah.
so they are hardly, opened.
Mhm.
It's amazing.
I've got a question for Sam. We were talking a little bit before about beliefs and culture perhaps being a barrier to sort of adaptation to a certain extent. How do people make sense of climate change, you can go on there. Would they sort of point the finger at rich countries, for example, for their carbon emissions, or would they, how is the change in the environment actually made sense of? And you know,
unfortunately, I think in an earlier published work I have done, they do not. The majority of people we interviewed did not relate climate change at all to what is happening in the West. I mean, they virtually did not find anybody mentioning that the problem is out there. So, yeah, they relate to climate change. They even have terminologies for it in the local balances around places we worked, and so they know that if you translate the way they are referring to climate change with the local patterns, it's giving you an indication. Like, for example, the Ghana people are saying, you know, change is literally, if you translate it, means changes in the weather. For example, okay, if you go to the FS, the accounts, they also have different ways of referring to it, but basically, they know that the weather, you know, they relate more to the weather, so the weather is changing. Okay, and then if you the cumulative effects is when we talk about the climate. So they are aware, farmers are aware that things are not like they used to be in the past when they knew when to plant. These days, the variations also, these days when they do plant, they know if they plant around this time, the rains will come. But now they plant, the rains doesn't come. And it's taking them a while to figure out what is happening. So they are quite aware of all the changes that is happening. That would be my response.
I think if I get your question right, you're asking if people are pointing fingers to the West. I think at the government level, there are very, very strong advocates, like the president of Kenya, for example. That I think another person who is being very, very vocal, capturing the term ecological imperialism, is the current chair or president of the African Development Bank. And I think there are, I think also the Prime Minister of, I think, Barbados. So at the international government level, there are very strong advocates. But just to capture what Sam is saying, locally, there's still that disconnect as to what the West has actually cost with respect to, we are feeling the brunt of your industrial revolution. But most of the people at the forefront of the government are actually very vocal. But they are, I think it's good to just balance that. They are not accusing the West, but they're just saying that make it easy for us to access resources to deal with the issues that you have caused on us. I think that has been the comment of Ruto all along, that it is a lot easier for the UK and many of these wealthy countries to access resources, even at a lower rate, compared to them who are at the forefront of climate change. They can't access resources and they even get higher interest rates. So I think that has been except if things have changed recently, I think that has been the discussion at the intergovernmental level.
Okay, well, thanks for that clarification. I was responding from the point of view of the people that
community
I've worked with, but yeah, he's right at the highest levels. Yeah, of course. We ourselves as academics, yeah, when you speak to us, we know what is happening, and we can point fingers at where they need to be pointed to. But I was referring to the people. Yeah.
Do you have any more questions? If not, well, thank you for a great discussion, and thank you very much to Matt and Sam for the great